Maciej Krupa is a journalist and mountain guide who lives and works in Zakopane. He's an anthropologist and historian by training and the co-founder of the local newspaper Tygodnik Podhalański. He's also a former BBC World Service producer, and you will hear him speak with that nice BBC intonation and the poise and gravitas that actually is stayed with him. Mr. Krupa has authored and co-authored several books and numerous publications on topics related to Zakopane and the Tatra Mountains. His most recent works in English include The Tatras, Zakopane, Podhale, a series of books published in 2018, The Outstanding Residents of the Zakopane Trail, 2017, and Zakopane, Past and Present, earlier work from 2004. We're very, very happy to have you here with us, and so please join me in giving him a warm welcome.
Good morning. Thank you for such a wonderful welcome. Thank you, Genevieve, and all the staff of Wiser Centers and Copernicus program in Polish Studies. I'm honored to be here, knowing who was lecturing here before, and that's really a great honor to be here. And let's start with the Polish Athens. I know that it sounds funny, the Polish Athens, but I hope that my lecture will explain that. And I prepared for you a couple of pictures which will be corresponding with what I'm talking about. We start from the first image from the times when photography haven't existed yet. It's 1840s, and that's the view of the entrance to Zakopane village. In Polish culture, the late 19th and early 20th centuries in Zakopane was of particular importance. This period in the history of Polish culture is called the Young Poland. In the freest place in Poland, partitioned by three neighboring empires, artists, scientists, social and political activists met. They took cures, rested, roamed the Tatras, discussed, created and conspired. The statesmen Józef Piłsudski and Roman Dmowski, writers Henryk Sienkiewicz and Stefan Żeromski, Dr. Kazimierz Dłuski and aristocrat Władysław Zamoyski, owner of Zakopane estate, anyone who meant anything in the spiritual life of the Poles frequented this place, praising and creating the aura of this extraordinary place. Among visitors there were people who will become well known also in America. Actress Helena Modrzewska, scientist and double Nobel laureate Maria Skłodowska-Curie, pianist Ignacy Jan Paderewski and Artur Rubinstein, anthropologist Bronisław Malinowski, writer Joseph Conrad. Thanks to all of them, this small Highlander village grew to the status of the Polish Athens. This was the moment when Zakopane achieved its spiritual peak, its stellar time. But first, I have to tell you how it all started. That's actually the oldest picture of Zakopane existing. You can see the date at the bottom, 1860. That's the very center of a village, very small place at that time. Zakopane, an alluring town, not only because it's so popular, so often visited by tourists, so beautifully surrounded by the Tatra Mountains. Its uniqueness was born in the time when it was discovered in the second half of the 19th century. Zakopane was then a small, shabby village at the foot of wild Virgin Mountains. How many other such places in Poland, even much older ones, remained solely villages? So many towns there are you would immediately want to abandon, escape from. It took 200 years for Zakopane to become a symbolic and truly significant place, not only on local but also on national scale. An extensive number of records on Zakopane, descriptions, drawings and finally photographs reflect a vivid interest in the Tatras and Zakopane. A French anthropologist, Roland Barthes, once wrote, "A photograph does not necessarily convey that something no longer exists. It says for sure that it existed. This is the basic distinction. Probably no place in Poland, except for the biggest cities, can take pride in such an abundant photographic documentation from the end of 19th century and the beginning of 20th century. Later on, photography grew more and more popular, the equipment more and more handy, and amateurs joined the group of professional photographers. This unique popularity and attractiveness of Zakopane contributed to the fact that we have such a richness of photographical records at our disposal, illustrating the past days of the town at the foot of the Giewont mountain. And that's the Giewont mountain, very significant mountain for Zakopane. If you look at its silhouette, it looks like a person lying on its back, and it's called a sleeping knight. That's the picture before the big cross was put on the top of Giewont. You'll see it on some other pictures, because it happened on the turn of the centuries in 1901, and that picture is slightly earlier. And as you can see, not too many houses at that time yet. The origins of Zakopane, as it usually happens, have faded away in the depth of history. Records of no longer existing documents mingle with legends and myths. Original copy of the oldest settlement rights, granted in 1578 by Stefan Batory, the King of Poland, did not survive to present days and is known only due to subsequent duplicates. Folk legends tell stories of the first settler from under the Tatras, the name of which, Gąsienica, means caterpillar in English, stem from his stripped attire. The legends account for where the name Zakopane originates from. The oldest documents that mention the name come from the beginning of 17th century. Highlanders from villages of the Lower Podhale, mountainous region of southern Poland, cleared the woods close to the Tatras. They settled there and built cradles of the subsequent village on clearings in the middle of forest. Treasure seekers, robbers, shepherds with flocks of sheep, as well as miners used to penetrate higher mountains. Originally, they looked for non-ferrous ores, but the beginning of 18th century witnessed an expansion of the iron ore mining. In the second half of the 18th century, in the Bystra Valley, first ironworks were built together with the surrounding settlements, which later evolved into today's Kuźnice. Kuźnica, that's a Polish name derived from kuźnia, which is a forge. The first period of Zakopane's development ended with the first partition of Poland. In the year 1770, the Empress of Austria, Maria Theresa, took over the Nowy Targ district under the pretext of putting a sanitary cordon against the spread of cholera epidemics. The crown lands were seized by Austrian Empire, whereas the peasants were still in possession of their land. At the turn of the 18th and 19th centuries, the Tatra Mountains were visited by scholars. Stanisław Staszic, a Pole, Belsazar Ake, a Frenchman, and a Scotsman, Robert Townsend. Staszic and probably Ake stayed at Kuźnice. However, in their accounts, they concentrated mainly on the Tatras and didn't devote much attention to a small village located at the foot of the mountains, although Stasic's description of the local people remains very appealing. Viscount Bryce, in his Memories of Travel, published in London in 1923, repeats his early text from 1878, The Mountains of Poland. James Bryce was a historian, professor at Oxford University, MP and later British ambassador to the United States. He visited Zakopane with Leslie Stephen, editor, author, journalist, fellow of Cambridge University, later father of Virginia Woolf and Vanessa Bell. Both gentlemen were alpinists, presidents of the Alpine Club, the oldest mountain organization in the world, and this explains they traveled to almost unknown mountains. That was the golden era of alpinism in Britain. That's a fragment of Bryce's description of Zakopane in 1878. Zakopane is the general name of a village or commune which consists of several hamlets lying scattered over a large area and resorted to for the mineral springs which rise out of the limestone rock. The best placed of these, and the one to which we had therefore come, is called the Ironworks, or sometimes the Hammer. That needs explanation because it wasn't called Hammer, it was Hamre. Hamre in the local dialect means ironworks. But he heard Hamre and made it Hammer out of that. It stands near the mouth of a glen, some 5 or 6 miles long, which runs due north from the axis of the range that divides Galicia from Hungary. On each side are steep mountains covered below with forest, at the top breaking into picturesque cracks of limestone. Down the middle runs a foaming stream of exquisitely clean green water, and behind, at the head of the valley, great peaks rise up against the brilliant southern sky. The hamlets consist of a row of iron forges with some cabins for the workers beside them, a miniature bathing house and an inn, a few primitive lodging houses, and the residence of the Prussian baron who has lately bought this property and is now working for the forges. His Schloss, as it is so grandly called, it is a large villa cottage, more like an Indian bungalow than a castle, with a pleasant flower garden in front. That's the end of the quote. That's the old church in Zakopane, as you can imagine. A small village grew peacefully north of Kuźnice under the Gubałówka hill. At the beginning, it was divided into 2 parishes of Poronin and Chochołów. Later, it expanded enough to establish a separate parish and build a church. The Zakopane landowners, Klementyna and Edward Homolacz, of Hungarian origin, financed building of a modest wooden church which was ready in 1847. Then the first parish priest came to Zakopane, the vicar Józef Stolarczyk. The center of the village called Na Wsie was located along a road leading from the church towards Kościelisko, later called the Kościeliska Street. The main artery of contemporary Zakopane, the Krupówki Street, has its beginnings in this particular route from Na Wsie to Kuźnice. Settlements were set up around the existing households, the names originating from family names and nicknames of the first settlers. Krzeptówki from Krzeptowski, Chramcówki from Chramiec. A school was established there, and in a wooden cottage near the church, today's house of Wnuk family, a first shop was opened by a salesman, Samuel Riegelhaupt, later on hosting also an inn and a post office. The number of holiday makers and tourists grew. First guidebooks and tourist descriptions of Zakopane and the Tatras were published. Up to this moment, the image of the village and its inhabitants had been presented solely on sketches and drawings. The year 1859 was a turning point. First photographers arrived in Zakopane, and they virtually immortalized the manor house, the village, and its inhabitants. A Warsawian doctor, Tytus Chałubiński, arrived in Zakopane in 1873 at the times of cholera epidemics. The doctor struggled to fight the consequences of the disease. Since then, the Highlanders held the doctor in great respect, while he manifested his love for the village at the foot of the Giewont mountain and for the Tatras towering over it. The doctor started to praise the blessing influence of the local climate on human health. As a result, Zakopane became a renowned health resort. The doctor became involved in all important social initiatives in Zakopane. It is due to his initiative that Zakopane was granted the status of the health resort, official status, a climatic station, as it was called, in 1886. First therapeutic homes and sanatoria were established, and Zakopane served as a health resort up till the 60s of the 20th century. Over the time, two monuments were built to commemorate Tytus Chałubiński. He was described as the king of the Tatras and the discoverer of Zakopane. Meanwhile, Poland was suffering under the burden of the partitions. However, Galicia enjoyed far greater scope of autonomy and relative freedom in comparison with other annexed territories. It was here that intelligentsia from all over Poland used to gather to enjoy the atmosphere of Zakopane, free of spies and persecutors. In the same year, 1873, a few citizens, including Chałubiński and Reverend Józef Stolarczyk, founded the Tatra Society in Zakopane, a tourist organization acting for the benefit of Zakopane and praising its virtues. The merits of the Tatra Society cannot be overvalued. It took the initiative to establish, among other, the School of Wood Industry, still existing today as Building Engineering School, one of the oldest schools of vocational training in Poland, founded in 1876, as well as the oldest regional museum in the country, the Tatra Museum, founded in 1888, named after its patron, Tytus Chałubiński. Together with the development of tourism and healthcare, the industrial activities in Kuźnice came to an end. The ironworks were closed in 1878, and the landowner of Zakopane estate, Magnus Pelc, replaced it with a paper mill. The bankruptcy of Pelc brought up about some ownership incidents, and as a result, the estate in Zakopane was put up for auction in 1889. It was purchased by a Polish patriot and the subsequent benefactor of Zakopane, Duke Władysław Zamoyski. He commenced afforestation of subalpine Tatra woods, cut down by the former owners, built the first waterworks, and undertook numerous economic and cultural initiatives. The tourism thrived. Wealthy people built houses in Zakopane. Some of them settled here permanently. Valery Eliasz, an excellent photographer as well, in his sketches from a journey to the Tatras, 1874, described these days as follows. During the summer days, a society gathers in Zakopane, not numerous, nevertheless more noble than in any other place. People come here mainly to visit the mountains or to rest their mind. Here, such persons meet who had previously only known each other names. Cordons dividing Poland disappear. We spend time chatting, therefore, even if full weather comes, only those can be bored who cannot occupy their minds, who cannot or do not want to seek any company, unquote. More and more artists, writers, and scholars arrived at the foot of Giewont. Zakopane became a center of Polish culture for the next 40 years. Pictures were painted, books were written, music was composed. First local magazines started to be published. Here you have the group of the oldest guides, Tatra mountain guides, local Highlanders dressed in local dresses, and formerly the guiding services started in as early as in 1875, although beforehand also there were guides guiding people to the mountains. And that's a typical scene of the mountain tour of that time, with the Tatras behind, with some horses, music, guides, and noble clientele. The first references to the Tatras are to be found in Old Polish literature, though the first works wholly based around the subject matter are two verses by Jakub Haur, dating back to 1702, but both of no particular special artistic value or charm. However, The most important period for the development of literature on the Tatras was that of so-called Young Poland period of late 19th and early 20th centuries. This saw several Tatra-based works locate themselves within the main current of Polish literature. The process began with the publication by Stanisław Witkiewicz of Na Przełęczy, On the Pass, in 1891. Within the firmament of poetry, the brightest stars were in turn Kazimierz Przerwa-Tetmajer and Jan Kasprowicz, and in prose, Władysław Orkan and Andrzej Struk. They are scenes of tourists at the end of 19th century visiting the Tatras. This is the lake regarded as the most beautiful in the Tatras, called Morskie Oko, the sea eye. And that little mountain, as you can imagine, to the right, very sharp one, is called the Monk. This is the seat of the Tatra Society, called the Tatra Manor. This is the first sanatorium of Dr. Hramiec, when the health station started. And this is that timber school I mentioned, founded in 1876. This building, believe me or not, still exists at Krupówki Street. Of course, in slightly better shape. And of course, skiing started as well in Zakopane at the end of 19th century. That's a picture from the very beginning of 20th centuries. And as you can see, it's quite picturesque. And I love that picture because that's a picture of shepherds in Whitewater Valley of Jurgów village. They were going with the flocks of sheep to the mountains to spend the whole summer in the mountains. And believe me, if I look at them and see some other, and it reminds me some pictures of Native Americans. It's of the same historical time almost, doesn't it? Okay, now I have to make a complicated operation. Excuse me. Maybe no. Okay. Oh. Yes. Super. Thank you very much. Thank you. If I was forced to name the most important element of the Polish Athens, which had the greatest impact on Zakopane then and nowadays, it would be probably Zakopane style in architecture. The first concepts of national style in Western Europe and the United States came about on the wave of the Romantic movement in country villa architecture, which is sometimes referred to as the picturesque rustic style. Commissioned by owners of country estates, the creators of this architecture sought inspiration in traditional country buildings, which at the end of the 18th and the first half of 19th century were made in a number of interesting ways. It started in France around 1780 from villas inspired by Swiss chalets, spread around Europe and reached United States about 1850. This trend culminated in England with Victorian Queen Anne style associated with the arts and crafts movement, and in the US with so-called shingle style developed in the late 1870s and early 1880s. In Poland, although partitioned by mid-19th century, there was discussion as to the possibility of creating a national Polish style using folk motifs. In 1886, Stanisław Witkiewicz, inspired by the Tatra region, became convinced that the architecture and folk art of the Podhale region fitted the aspirations of a national style in architecture. There were more people involved in the idea of Zakopane style. Lawyer and ethnographer Bronisław Dębowski and his wife Maria, Dr. Władysław Matlakowski, Wojciech Brzega, and many others. The former owner of one of the gems of Zakopane style, House Under the Firs, art historian Professor Jacek Woźniakowski suggested that even one American could be involved. He meant American architect Henry Hobson Richardson, who adopted the ideas of the arts and crafts movement and whose earlier buildings share many similarities to the Zakopane-style house of Woźniakowski's family. But Stanisław Witkiewicz was the first to articulate and realize the first Polish national style in built architecture. His aim was to transform a Podhale cottage into, quote, a Polish building able to meet more sophisticated requirements and standards of convenience. Actually, this is the first villa built by Witkiewicz according to his design, Villa Koliba, still existing in Zakopane and now housing the Museum of Zakopane style. This is the second Pepita, later named Łada, second building designed by Witkiewicz. And Villa Oksha, the third one, also now a branch of the Tatra Museum, housing the Gallery of Modern Art. Stanisław Witkiewicz was born on 21st of May 1851 in Poszawsze in Samogitia, one of the regions of Lithuania. Nowadays, this place is called Pasiausze. A painter, literary and artistic critic and writer. After January Uprising, he was sent with parents, sister and brother to Tomsk in western Siberia. In 1868, he returned and started study of painting and academies of fine arts in St. Petersburg and Munich. Later, he lived in Warsaw, active as a painter and art critic. He came to Zakopane for the first time at the invitation of Marian Bronisław Dębowski in the winter of 1886, where he noticed the Podhale folk architecture that could be the basis for the development of the new national style. In the years 1886-1890, he wrote two important books, a reportage, The Tatras in the Snow, and an essay, sometimes called a novel, On the Pass. The second book was a foundation for the ideas of Young Poland period as well as for the Polish Athens. That book was later called The Gospel of the Tatras, and it is still regarded as a fundamental book on the Tatras, Zakopane and Podhale region. In 1890, because of tuberculosis, he settled in Zakopane. He designed, among others, the following villas: Koliba, Oksha, Pod Jedlami, Under the Firs. That's Zofiówka, that's another one. This one does not exist. It burnt out in 1945, just after the Second World War. And that's House Under the Firs, regarded as the gem of the Zakopane style. That's original drawing of Stanisław Witkiewicz. Then Villa Rialto, the chapel in Jaszczurówka and the Tatra Museum, as well as several buildings outside of Zakopane. He considered himself, until the end of his life, as an artist painter, never as an architect. He never claimed to be an architect. In 1908, severely ill, he was forced to go to Lovran at Adriatic Sea, now in Croatia, where he passed away on 5th of September 1915. He was buried in the old cemetery in Zakopane. So now you can see a couple of pictures of the villa Under the Firs, still existing, being in private hands, and survived in a fantastic shape, especially that Witkiewicz was a kind of total designer. So he didn't design only the building, but also the furniture, the curtains, the lamps, basically everything. And it's unbelievable, but in this house, in the big living room, the curtains are original from 1896, embroidered by the wife of Witkiewicz, Maria Witkiewiczowa, and they are still there, which in Poland and turmoil of two world wars, it's quite unbelievable thing. That's the same villa from a different angle. It went even, you can see a big balcony here on the corner. In Highlanders dialect, it's called przyłap. And it went to Polish literature because Henryk Sienkiewicz, famous Polish author, Nobel Prize laureate, he was visiting Pawlikowski family in this villa, and they were sitting on that balcony, and he heard the name przyłap. And if you read carefully Sienkiewicz novel Krzyżacy, Teutonian Knights, on the first scene when Maciek is receiving his cousin Zbyszko z Bogdańca, you can read, they were sitting, siedzieli na przyłapie. He took that word from that, precisely that building. And that's a very nice model of a house under the firs, made to a scale, made specially for the World Exhibition in Paris in 1900. So it went there with a group of its builders, and Witkiewicz here you can see birded in the hat. And this picture is made, of course, in Zakopane, but this model traveled to Paris and back, and now it's presented in the Tatra Museum. What's that? Oh, sorry. Oh. I'll spoil that, okay. I usually ask people, what's that? And they say, a shrine, or whatever. That's a well. That's the example how total designer Witkiewicz was. That's the well of the house, still existing. And that's how it looks nowadays. So the first building was Villa Koliba, designed and built for Zygmunt Gnatowski. The last one, the main building of the Tatra Museum, finished after the Great War in 1922, completed 7 years after death of its designer. The span of classical Zakopane style is just 30 years, from 1892 till 1922. There is another building, Dr. Hawranek Sanatorium, other name Rialto. This building still exists in Zakopane. That's a new parish church. Of course, it's not Zakopane style, but inside you have two altars designed by Witkiewicz. That one, Our Lady of Rosary altar, and the whole chapel of St. John the Baptist, which is whole designed in Zakopane style. Another villa, Ślimak Villa, on the main street, Krupówki, as it looks today. Villa Ornak of Sokołowski family. It's not Witkiewicz design, designed by Kazimierz Kretschmer, because he had his followers, obviously. I just concentrated on that. And this is Villa Konstantynówka. I will refer to it next, telling you about one very famous man who stayed there in Konstantynówka. And the Red Manor House, Władysławka, very closely connected with the Republic of Zakopane I was talking about 2 days ago, because that was the headquarters of Zakopane Republic. That was the place when Stefan Żeromski stayed during the First World War. So for the Republic of Zakopane, it was the White House. The Tatra Manor, the new Tatra Manor, because the old wooden building burned out in 1899, and that one was built in 1903. And one of the last designed by the nephew of Stanisław Witkiewicz and Witkiewicz-Koszczyc for the family, Witkiewiczówka. That's the place when Witkacy, Stanisław Ignacy Witkiewicz, son of Stanisław Witkiewicz, lived till the end of the Second Republic, virtually till the end of his life. And the only building in the Tatras, not in town, but deep in the Tatras, the mountain shelter at Morskie Oko, at Eye of the Sea. It is a listed building, of course, and the only one in Zakopane style, very deep inside the Tatras. The designer was Tadeusz Praus. And one of the last designs of Stanisław Witkiewicz, the chapel of Jaszczurówka in Zakopane, still existing. the only sacred building he designed, as far as I know. That's how it looks today. And a very little thing, because he was doing such things as well, a little shrine at Korniłowicz Villa in Zakopane, very small, cozy, also in Zakopane style. And that's the last design of Witkiewicz, the main building of the Tatra Museum. Dobrze. Co my teraz mamy zrobić? Tak. Right. So Stanisław Witkiewicz, in his young age, when he got to Zakopane, basically in the early 1890s. Speaking of the Polish Athens, one cannot forget people of international fame who were regular visitors to Zakopane, sometimes even residents, and for whom that was a very, very special place. Helena Modrzejewska, 1840-1909, renowned Polish and American actress who specialized in Shakespearean roles. She regularly visited Zakopane from 1867 till 1902 and even built a house there called Modrzejów. That's a picture with very interesting inscription. It says, "In the name of my godmother, I offer that to Tympcio," that was a friend of Witkacy, and it's written Helena Modrzejewska. Witkacy, son of Stanisław Witkiewicz, was a renowned Polish artist, drama writer, photographer, novelist, philosopher, and probably the most inventive Polish artist of the 20th century. And Helena Modrzejewska was his godmother. And that's the picture of her villa in Zakopane, Modrzejów, not existing anymore. Imagine that even when she was well settled here in California, she used to travel to spend summer in this house in Zakopane. And these days, she had to go through whole America on train, then board the ship, go to Britain, then on a train to Kraków, then on a train to Chabówka, and from Chabówka another day on horses to Zakopane, just to spend 3 or 4 weeks in Zakopane and come back to California. Would you do that? Ignacy Jan Paderewski, 1860-1841, Polish pianist, composer, politician, statesman, prime minister of Poland, was a regular visitor of Zakopane between 1883 and 1913. We can say that his career started here. And it's closely connected with Modrzejewska, because when she made a huge opening of her house in Zakopane, of Modrzejów, she invited Dr. Tytus Chałubiński, of course. And he brought with him a very young, aspiring pianist, very handsome and young. And he played, of course, on that opening. Modrzejewska got fascinated and invited him, let's have a concert together in Kraków. And they made it 3 weeks later in center of Kraków. Of course, her name drew plenty of attention, and there were tickets. So he collected enough money which allow him to go to Vienna and Paris for further studies. So we can say that in a way his international career somehow started partly due to Modrzejewska's help, and it started in Zakopane. Another person, very serious on that photograph, Henryk Sienkiewicz, 1846-1916, Polish writer, novelist and journalist, Nobel Prize laureate in 1905, regular visitor of Zakopane between 1886-1906. His international bestseller, Quo Vadis, has its premiere in Zakopane in 1894. And most people don't know that, because Sienkiewicz was just spending holidays in Zakopane, and the works with the new church, new parish church, were going, and they were lacking of funds. So the priest Kazimierz Kaszelewski, at that time the vicar of the local parish, came to Sienkiewicz with a couple of citizens of Zakopane and asked him kindly, could you give a lecture, public lecture, that we can gather some money for the building of the new church? And Sienkiewicz said, with pleasure. I am just working on something new, and I'm willing to check it with the public. And we have two separate independent descriptions of that evening, so we precisely know that he was presenting the last chapter of Quo Vadis, The Fire of Rome. Precisely the last scene when the narrator is looking at the Rome in fire. The biggest international bestseller of Sienkiewicz, Quo Vadis, was started in Zakopane. Another person, Bronisław Malinowski, 1884-1942, one of the most important anthropologists in 20th century, professor of Yale University, regular visitor of Zakopane before 1914. Young person here, that's a picture done by Stanisław Ignacy Witkiewicz. As you can see, it's on the glass and broken, so that's what reminds from the original. Malinowski was a really frequent visitor of Zakopane, and also we can say that start of his big international career as an anthropologist started somehow, because in 1914 Stanisław Ignacy Witkiewicz-Fiancé committed suicide. It was a very picturesque scene in the mountains with a big bunch of flowers. He shot herself with a Browning to her head in the presence of the horse carriage rider who took her there. And there were gossips why it all happened, and Witkiewicz, young Witkiewicz, blamed himself. So Maria Witkiewiczowa, wife of Stanisław Witkiewicz, asked Bronisław Malinowski, at that time the closest friend of Witkiewicz, do something with him. Malinowski was already planning the long trip to Melanesia, and he asked Witkacy to go with him as a photographer and drawer. And they went to Australia. There was an anthropological congress in Melbourne, and they were caught by the outbreak of the First World War there. So there was a discussion what to do, and they split. Witkacy went back to Europe and finished in St. Petersburg, when he spent the whole First World War in the Tsar's Special Regiment. And Malinowski went to Trebriand Islands, as you know, which resulted with the Argonauts of Western Pacific, and probably the most famous of his books, The Sexual Life of Savages in Northwestern Melanesia, and became world-renowned anthropologist. So it started in Zakopane somehow. That's Stanisław Ignacy Witkiewicz, his self-portrait. He was also very good experimental photographer of his times. Who else? Of course, Karol Szymanowski. 1882-1937, Polish composer and pianist, regular visitor of Zakopane between 1894 and 1930, and resident from 1930 till 1935. And his close friend was Artur Rubinstein, probably the most famous Polish pianist. It's very difficult to say it's not sports when you can give, scores and places, but long life, 1887-1982. He was playing concerts till he was 90. That's unbelievable. That's probably one of the world's records. He came first to Zakopane in 1904 and met in Zakopane both Szymanowski and Witkacy. And that's another story, because Rubinstein was then with the Wertheim family, who were his sponsors, and they were residing, by the way, in the Red Manor, that place which will be the White House during the Zakopane Republic later on. They stayed there because they have a very good piano, and Rubinstein was able to practice in the evenings. And he had a strange feeling that somebody is watching him. So on the second or third evening, he jumped to the window and seen that there is a young guy standing on the other side. He was frightened a little bit, but he said, "Okay, don't worry. My name is Bronisław Gromadzki. I am amateur violinist, and I just was passing the road and heard that lovely piano play, and I couldn't stop myself for coming here every evening listening to you. And you know, my close friend, he is a young composer. His name is Karol Szymanowski. You don't know him because nobody knows him yet, but he's absolutely great. You must meet, guys." And he sent a cable asking Szymanowski to come to Zakopane, which happened in a couple of days. And they both met, and the next day they have dinner with Witkacy, which eventually led to travel of Szymanowski and Witkacy to Sicily, and resulted in King Roger, the most famous Szymanowski's opera, and friendship, long-term friendship between Szymanowski and Rubinstein, because Rubinstein became the first serious ambassador of Szymanowski's music in America and worldwide. So it all happened in Zakopane.
We all came to Ann Arbor too.
Another.
My freshman year, I think it was Rubinstein's last concert at the University of Michigan, must have been 1969.
Another person connected with Zakopane, among many others, were Maria Skłodowska-Curie, 1867-1934. She was twice in Zakopane, second time in 1911 after her second Nobel Prize in Chemistry. And her link to Zakopane, it's that building. That's a very modern TB sanatorium created by Kazimierz Dłuski and Bronisława Dłuska. Bronisława Dłuska was the older sister of Maria Curie, who went to study in Paris and brought her younger sister in. And he met her husband Kazimierz Dłuski in Paris. They were both doctors. They returned to Poland and decided to create the modern sanatorium on the professional way, how they were doing these years in the Alps, in Davos and other locations. You all know Thomas Mann's famous novel. So that was our Berghof in Zakopane, very modern, up to European standards at that time, finished in 1902, and that's a place when, of course, some of Nobel Prize money were invested, as well as some of the investors were Henryk Sienkiewicz and Ignacy Jan Paderewski. This building still exists in Kościelisko, which is a village next to Zakopane. And again, Konstantynówka building in Zakopane style, you've seen the picture before, but that was a place when Józef Konrad Korzeniowski stayed in autumn 1914. And that's a short story about that visit. Konrad decided to bring his English family to Poland to show them the places of his young years. And they came to Kraków. When they were on the train, Gavrilo Princip killed the young Austrian prince in Sarajevo, which started the First World War. And instantly, Konrad, British citizen, was on the other side of the front in the enemy country. It was serious danger that they all will be interned in Poland. So he decided to go to Zakopane because he knew that his cousin Maria Zagórska was, Aniela Zagórska, was running a little family hotel in Villa Konstantynówka in Zakopane. So they came to Zakopane, hid there. He was meeting with, of course, the local artists and going to the mountains. And we have very nice descriptions. I have a story on that. because both his sons, Boris and John, and his wife and him left some recollections of the visit in Zakopane. So you have a view from 4 points, actually, which is very, very interesting. He spent here in Konstantynówka 6 weeks when he got the iron letter from the Austrian authorities through Kraków, Vienna, to Genova, and on the ship back to England. They went back. But that was a very memorable and important visit. And because I'm running out of time, that's actually the end of the Polish Athens. 1914, then the turmoil of the First World War, and then Zakopane Republic. That's the end of that golden era, that stellar time of Zakopane. The next few years, the Second Republic, that's the building of the church supported by Henryk Sienkiewicz, and that's how it looks. And then that's the place of meetings of artists during the Second Republic in Zakopane. Zakopane became a resort. There was no need for a place for conspiracy or discussing the independence or other political matters. It became rather a place of rest, but also very popular with artists. So that's Stefan Żeromski. I talked about him 2 years ago, Józef Piłsudski, caricature of Józef Piłsudski. Kazimierz Przerwa-Tetmajer, famous Polish poet, connected with Zakopane and resident of Zakopane for many years. Wojciech Brzega, local Highlander who studied in Paris in Academy of Fine Arts in 1900. Stanisław Witkiewicz with his son Witkacy, very famous, as I told you, in my humble opinion, the most influential Polish artist of 20th century. That's Witkacy. And that's Witkacy with another famous Polish writer, that one to the right, which is Bruna Schulz. And Witkacy skiing. A quite desperate way, huh? Zakopane developed as a resort. In 1936, the cable car to Kasprowy Wierch was built, and that was a very, very modern facility for that time, making Zakopane one of the best equipped ski resorts in Europe. And the very, very modern sanatorium were built in the late 20s and 30s. That's the sanatorium for students, and the second building behind, that's for teachers. TB was a serious problem at that time all over the world, and Zakopane was probably the most important center of curing TB in Poland at that time. Another sanatorium called Sanato. And that's another famous cafe when artists and writers met on Krupówki Street. This building does not exist. View on Zakopane at that time, that's the central park of Zakopane, town park. And that's a very fast train which was connecting Kraków with Zakopane. As far as I remember, the record time at that time was 2 hours, 26 minutes, and it wasn't beaten. So nowadays, trains are slower. And here you can see Krupówki, the main street at night, Morskie Oko, another place of meetings of local artists, and a famous hotel. That's it. I have to shorten that, but still went too long. Excuse me for that. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for this fascinating lecture. We have about 15-20 minutes for question and discussion, so please, Maciej, would you take the questions yourself?
Yeah, of course, yes.
What does it mean po kulturach nie jeździć?
Po kulturach nie jeździć. Yeah. There was a sign with these skiers, po kulturach nie jeździć. Kultura, culture, derives from agriculture. The name comes from agriculture. Kultury in Polish means crops, fields. So that's It's archaic, of course, but that means, yeah, cropland or whatever, yeah, agricultural land. So that explains.
Can you say something about, you said that some of the houses are still privately owned, so the one that was built by Witkacy and that even Witkiewicz. So even the interior design, the curtains.
Yeah.
So is there some kind of protection then that's?
No, not really. Some of, usually with properties there is a complex story. Somebody sold something, somebody bankrupt, somebody bought it, or it was inherited by the state or whatever, or municipality. In the case of that building, house under the firs, it is in the hands of the same family, Pawlikowski family. That's a fascinating history of Pawlikowskis, and that's could be for another lecture. But basically, it was a very noble family, landowners, very well educated, and very sort of with very wide minds. Jan Gwalbert, who built that house, who financed that house, he was a big landowner in Medyka, which is now on the border between Poland and Ukraine. Huge estate there. He was professor of agriculture in Dublany, which is now also in Ukraine. It used to be Eastern Poland. So he was professor of agriculture. But in free time, he was writing on Słowacki's plays, especially Król Duch, and his book on that drama is regarded by the specialists as the best book written on that. People were very, very flexible at these times. And he was also the pioneer of the protection of the environment and creation of the Tatra National Park. Anyway, how it happened, that's oral history, what I will just say, but his wife, Wanda, was of course very well educated lady. She speaks several languages. So I've heard the story that the First World War wasn't any problem because there was no front close to Zakopane, so Zakopane was outside of the all military activity. During the Second World War, some German officers came in, but first of all, it wasn't at that time too modern. There was still no electricity or indoor plumbing, so there was, well outside, whatever. But anyway, when they came, she went to them, and in absolutely perfect Viennese German said them to go out, and they went. Unbelievable story. At the end of the war, Russians came in, and again thinking about taking this property, and she, in absolutely perfect Russian, said them to piss off, and they went. And that, that strong lady survived, secured the house twice, and there was really no legal, I know that communists didn't follow the legal rules, but there was no legal way to take it over. So somehow, due to many good circumstances, it survived, and it's still in the hands of the same family. Of these now, of this family, there is Róża Thun, who is a Polish European MP. Her brother Henryk is the head of a big publishing house called Znak in Kraków. Another co-owner is Karol Tarnowski, professor of philosophy on Papal University in Kraków, and many others. So this is still family very active in a public way, and they created a special foundation, special charity. So it's now, the building is owned by the charity. They use it, of course, as their summer holiday house, but also they host occasionally small cultural events inside, and that's the occasion to see it inside. And believe me, it's worth it.
Is the same family that Polish poet Maria Pawlikowska-Jasnorzewska?
Yes. Maria Pawlikowska-Jasnorzewska was the second wife of the youngest son of Jan Gwalbert Pawlikowski, Jan Gwalbert Henryk Pawlikowski. That's right. And she was living there for a couple of years until they split.
fascinated by the Zakopane style, and I'm more interested in like its contemporary fate today in Poland, considering the history of Zakopane style as being this national style and built environment, first national style in Poland, using folk motifs. Is it now used by nationalistic movements in reclaiming the heritage and reclaiming the folklore as this like purely Polish stuff that we need to protect? Like what's its politics today?
Zakopane style, it's kind of phenomenon because it's the only national style in the history of Polish architecture. We haven't developed anything in Gothic, Baroque, or Renaissance. You know, everything was adopted from either Germany or Italy or somewhere else. So that's the only national style. And its historical span, as I told you, is between 1892 till 1922. But it has influence till now. In the popular discussions in the media, you can hear, you know, somebody claiming you should still build in Zakopane style. People still perceive it as a continuing thing. Of course, if we go deeply into that, there was the so-called second Zakopane style during the years of the Second Republic, and several buildings, very nice buildings, designed by pupils of Witkiewicz and some other architects were built at that time. And later on, what's very interesting, if we are talking about social realism in Poland, 50s, okay, it's connected with this new Nowa Huta town next to Kraków, or some quarters of Warsaw, as a monumental architecture, whatever. In Zakopane, it's regarded in a very positive way because a group of local architects told, okay, we are now Republic of workers and peasants, so we will build new buildings based on peasants' houses. And they continued in a slightly different way, Zakopane style. So the same material, maybe more stone, but still plenty of timber, the same angle of the roof, the same decoration around. And these buildings still exist, like a new Aries Hotel, which used to be the biggest shingle-covered wooden roof in Europe. Or some mountain shelters built on the break of 40s and 50s, still are continuation of Zakopane style, or even called the third Zakopane style. If you look at some buildings nowadays, they are still continuing that direction. So definitely Stanisław Witkiewicz, it's in terms of the outer look of the town, okay? It's the most influential person, and it's his heritage, it's still prevailing. Of course, there's plenty of new ugly constructions, and that was the end of my speech here, when I put such a sentence. Unfortunately, the historical fabric of the town is disappearing before our eyes. Old historic buildings are demolished, and in their place, characterless apartment buildings are being created. What will be the future of the town at the foot of the Polish Tatra Mountains? This is a question I'm afraid of, and I do not dare to answer. But still this building exists. Many of them are listed. And many people building a new stuff are asking architects to follow that direction. So fortunately, you have both. And they are very good example of very good architecture following Witkiewicz ideas being erected nowadays. So it's still a live process.
Can you specify what exactly they are following?
What they are following?
Yeah, like
they are following the material, which is timber plus stone. They are following the typical features, which is the angle of the roof, the shape of the door and windows, the specific parts of decoration like the sunbeams on the rooftops and on the door, the specific endings on the rooftops called rische, I don't know, risch is links in English. So there are specific decorative motifs which are still, they were taken from the folk architecture, folk buildings, adopted by Witkiewicz, and they still use them. So these are the basic things. I would say the form.
Okay.
I'm curious because in 1960 in Warsaw, I bought a picture of a church, a stave church. Where is that architecture? I mean, is it part of this in terms of church architecture? You know, it's got all the things you're describing of the slants and.
It might be. Of course, Zakopane style, it wasn't only in Zakopane and surroundings. Witkiewicz designed several buildings even in Lithuania. There is one building in Kraków in Szpitalna Street, which is in Zakopane style. Of course, not with a steep roof, but with all these decorative elements. There is one building in Warsaw as well in that style. So it went outside of Zakopane, of course. As I told you, even in railway station in Sigłudyszki in Lithuania was in Zakopane style. So it is very likely, yeah.
So were there many churches built in this style?
Not too many, no, not too many, as far as I know.
But you had wooden churches that were not in the Zakopane style, but that we might, you know,
Yeah.
mistake for that.
Yeah.
Wooden churches and synagogues that were.
Right, well,
That's
at
right.
the time, it kind of reminded me of what you saw up in Norway and
Because, you know, it started very early, is we talk about churches. There is a chain of medieval wooden churches in Podhale, about a bit 20 miles north of Zakopane. There are 5 of them: Nowy Targ, Łopuszna, Ostrowsko, Harklowa, Grywałd. They still exist. The oldest is from 1490s, the youngest from 1520. They 3 exist. They all exist. And of course they were kind of a foundation for the new things. You know, the local conditions, the mountains, these buildings depict the mountains. The steep roofs has practical meanings, but also every grassroots architecture has to fit the countryside. It was obvious that looking at these sharp peaks, they were building roofs, you know, which are also sharp and are depicting these mountains. Of course, they have practical meaning to keep the snow off and stuff. Witkiewicz didn't invent anything completely new. Everything what he done is based on the local architecture he's seen, blown up into bigger scale, more comfort, more decoration. So, of course, it was his invention, but it was solidly based on what he had seen and documented.
Could you follow up on that sentence that you read that you did not include in the lecture itself because you ran out of time, about things becoming different now, kind of disappearing in front of our eyes? What I mean is the conservancy policy. Like, we know that there are certain small towns in Poland, like Kazimierz nad Wisłą comes to mind, that even after 1945 and then 1989, that did not become so, to put it nicely, eclectic.
Yeah.
And messed up.
Yeah, the problem is that Zakopane is the most popular holiday place in Poland. So the price of the land is enormous if you compare to the other places. And the pressure of investors and developers, it's immense. And in my opinion, as a citizen of Zakopane, the local law and also state law doesn't protect this enough. there should be much more strict regulations, because goodwill and sentiment for the old will never prevail money and human greed. I'm afraid.
Of course, if you destroy all the old, will people go back there? I mean, one of the attractions, at least from what I know, is going to places where you do have this continuous history.
You are right. The question is if those who invest care about that at all. I don't know. I leave it open.
Any more questions?
I have a question for you.
Could you tell us about your skirt?
Actually, it is. Yes, it's Tamara Wempicka. So it's a Polish-born painter who went to Paris, married a duke or a count, and then came to Hollywood and painted in the 1920s and 30s Hollywood people.
One of the highest rank in terms of sales. Polish artists nowadays. Yes?
It's beautiful.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you
so I'd like to thank you very much to all of you, Genevieve, Marysia, Ron Weiser, and everybody who organized my visit here, allowed me to have those 2 lectures and exhibition. It was really great pleasure to visit you and have opportunity to speak to you. And I'm really very, very grateful. Thank you very much for all you've done.
Thank you.